Okay, so welcome everyone to this event. The idea behind the event is that we are using this session to mark the 5th anniversary of Overland Oversea. Overland Oversea came about after poets in the East Midlands saw what was happening in the Mediterranean and how governments in Europe were letting people perish in the Mediterranean or lead very difficult lives in informal settlements in places like the jungle in France, or Dunkirk, also in France, or in the camps in places like Moira and Lesbos. So we suggested putting together a poetry anthology that one would be used to respond to the narrative that we were getting that was coming from politicians and the media in Europe, and also which would raise funds for groups that were conducting search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean, in and around the Mediterranean, and also groups that were supporting people looking for refuge who had made it to Europe. Specifically with Overland Oversea, we were raising funds for Doctors Without Borders, the Nottingham and Nottinghamshire Refugee Forum, and Leicester City of Sanctuary. And then as we were going about promoting Overland Oversea, we settled on an idea of taking a number of poems from the anthology and encouraging as many people as possible to translate those poems, those few poems, into other languages. And I think that's when we met Monica and Pietro. That was in 2017. And then, you know what happens with good ideas. The idea grew, and it became a suggestion that, okay, so we've got 10% of the anthology now available in 20 or so languages, and also some of the poems are available in other art forms. Why can we not expand this and try and see if we can get the whole anthology into other languages? And Monica and also Pietro have been working on those translations through their efforts. Overland Oversea is now available in Italian, and a Romanian translation, yes, and the Romanian translation is going to be available very soon. The Romanian translation is going to be followed by other translations. For example, anticipating that very soon there's going to be a Spanish translation. So we've got people who are in the UK, and also people in Spain and people in South America who are working collaboratively on a Spanish translation of Overland Oversea. So speaking for myself, I find the work that we are doing, I find it exciting, which is also part of why in the material that we've posted in which we are promoting this event, and also the last one that was held at the University of Leicester a few weeks ago, some of the questions that we keep asking is, who is poetry for? Related to that question is also, what is poetry for? What purpose does poetry serve? What function, what use does poetry serve? Can it serve in an environment such as the one that we are living in? And there are also other questions, like, for example, what happens when poems migrate from one language to another? And then thinking also of people who are looking for refuge. I don't know if some of you have seen some of the poems that have since been discovered, that were written by people who were making those journeys across the Mediterranean, some of whom subsequently drowned. But what survived, part of what survived, are reflections and thoughts that they were sharing on why they were making those journeys. And some of those reflections are poetry. We'll try and collate some of those poems, and then maybe see if we cannot include them in future discussions around this. So I think for now, I will stop here, but also invite Chris, for example, for maybe if you could tell us what you think poetry is for and who it is for. And yeah.
The easy questions first then, eh? I suppose I've always believed that poetry has a power to change hearts and minds, which is why it's so important that we have a volume like Overland, Oversea, because it does address questions that are important and we need to make people think about. And having it in translation, I mean, obviously means it has a much wider application. We hope more and more people will read it. I mean, the business of translation is a difficult one, isn't it? Because it's so much about measure, it's often so much about rhyme, and it's often the case that when you have your poems translated, and I've had mine translated into some strange languages like Arabic, and my Arabic is slightly rusty, I have to admit, along with my Romanian and my Italian and my Spanish. So you never quite know how the poems change. But if we can, I think Adrian Mitchell said most poems are of no interest to some people, because I can't exactly remember the quotes, maybe somebody else can. Something about not being, most people aren't interested in poetry because most poetry isn't interested in other people. And lots of poetry is complex, difficult to understand. So the more we can communicate it, as indeed he did, great fan of Adrian Mitchell, so sure lots of other people are, to write it simply and to hit the heart smack in the middle is our job as poets, and to make them think and change how they think about subjects like this, which are so important, with more refugees now on the move than there were after the Second World War. And that's a very, very shocking statistic, I think. That's me.
Does anyone else want to come in on what poetry is for? Who is it for? Why poetry? Why are we doing this?
Doesn't it have to be for everybody? Doesn't it have to communicate with everybody we humanly can? It's often seen as elitist, isn't it, poetry, that it's not going to be of interest to people other than poets. It's a sort of minority sport. But if we can stop it being that, then we will, like Adrian Mitchell, will have served an important process, I think.
Richard, did you want to add something?
Well, I agree with that, and I think it's real. One of its real values is its ability to touch other people and communicate with them and touch them on quite a deep level. And I do think in the whole sphere of poetry about refugees, I'm closely involved with some work refugees are doing in Bristol, and I do think it must be of value to asylum seekers here to know that there is a community out there that is wishing them well, that is on their side, that is it's got something to say to them and about them, that they're recognised. And I think that's in this particular context of this anthology. That's another valuable purpose of it.
Like I'm going to pick on people. Caroline.
Hi. Hi, Ambrose.
Hi.
Yeah, great to hear all that's been happening. Yeah, I think that poetry is a kind of communication across a distance where you can be close across a distance. I like the way in which it can combine those two things at once, closeness and distance. So in that respect, I suppose recently I've been thinking about poetry as a form of communing, that word to commune, as it were. And there you can find yourself communing with a complete stranger. Yeah, so I kind of been interested in that aspect of it.
Mm. And then we started with Chris because Chris has a poem, The Insurrection of Poetry, which I think also in many ways speaks to a lot of what Overland Oversea was trying to do. And it also speaks to what we are trying to do with the translation effort. So maybe you could introduce the Insurrection of Poetry, give us some of the context.
Yes, I don't think it has a context other than the will to indicate that what we do is important and it can change the way we think. And I suppose it sprang out. My number two son was mobilized to Iraq in 2003, which is not great for a pacifist mum. And it was probably the worst 5 years of my life, not knowing where he was or what he was doing, hoping he was distributing aid, but fearing that he probably was not. After Suez, one of the great political outrages of this, well, this and the last century. So it's called The Insurrection of Poetry, and I use the word insurrection advisedly. I'll read it. And before I do, I just wanted to say thank you to Ambrose, because I know you've put an enormous amount of work into all this project, and it's very important, and I'm honoured to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Insurrection of Poetry. Poems are on the march. They are singing from the rubble of Ground Zero, the ruins of Damascus and Sarajevo, the bomb shelters of Amaraya, the poisoned bodies of Halabja, from the mouths of murdered menfolk in Srebrenica. Poems are growing from their winding sheets in the mud and trenches of butchered nature. Their guns fire white poppies. Their flags are the color of rainbow. Their hands hold paper cranes under the olive trees. From the bones of mutilated generations, they grow blossoms of resurrection. Listen, you tyrants, murderers, fundamentalists, mutilators, rapists, occupiers, racists, persecutors, autocrats, crucifiers, fanatics, torturers, liars, obfuscators, manipulators, warmongers, silencers. Listen, poems from all over the world are saying, enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe we bring in Monica and Pietro now. If you translated the Insurrection of Poetry, you also translated most of all the poems in Overland Oversea. How was the experience for you?
At the beginning, I translated only those poems that were on the blog Journeys in Translation, and then the next step was to bring some of these poems in the classroom, to show them to my students, to work on them together. And then so first we talked about the poems, and then another step was to try to translate them, to give them a final form. For my students who are, let's say, intermediate students, and some of them advanced, it was quite a challenge, but some of them could translate the poems very well. And then I repeated this experience with two other groups over these years. And then this summer I decided to translate all the poems, and this winter holidays I'm going to give the final shape. Yeah. So shall I read the Insurrection of Poetry?
Yes, please.
Insurecția poeziei. Poeziile au pornit marșul. Au început să cânte din molozul rămas în centrul exploziei, din ruinele de la Damasc și din Sarajevo, din adăpostul antiatomic de la Amiria, din corpurile otrăvite din Halabja, din gurile bărbaților uciși la Srebrenica. Poemele cresc din giulgiuri în noroiul și tranșeele naturii măcelărite, dar din armele lor pornesc macii albi. Steagurile lor au culorile curcubeului. Cu mâinile fac berze, origami din hârtie, la umbra măslinilor. Pe oasele generațiilor mutilate cresc florile reînvierii. Ascultați, voi, tiranilor, criminalilor, fundamentaliștilor, mutilatorilor, violatorilor, ocupanților, rasiștilor, prigonitorilor, autocraților, crucificatorilor, fanaticilor, călăilor, mincinoșilor, aburitorilor, manipulatorilor, agitatorilor, reducători la tăcere. Ascultați! Poeziile din toată lumea spun destul. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think maybe we, from that reading, we also go into the Italian reading of the same poem.
Can you hear me, Ambrose?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I read first?
Yes.
Right. L'insurrezione della poesia. Le poesie sono in marcia, stanno cantando dalle macerie di Ground Zero, le rovine di Damasco e Sarajevo, i rifugi antiaereo di Emiria, i corpi intossicati di Halabja, dalle bocche dei maschi ammazzati a Srebrenica. Le poesie stanno crescendo dai loro sudari nel fango e nelle trincee della natura macellata. Le loro armi sparano papaveri bianchi, le loro bandiere sono del colore dell'arcobaleno, le loro mani creano gru di carta sotto gli alberi d'ulivo. Dalle ossa di generazioni mutilate fanno crescere germogli di risurrezione. Ascoltate, voi tiranni, assassini, fondamentalisti, mutilatori, stupratori, occupanti, razzisti, persecutori, despoti, crocifissori, fanatici, torturatori, impostori, mistificatori, manipolatori, guerrafondai, silenzianti. Ascoltate, le poesie in tutto il mondo stanno dicendo basta. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. And how was the process for you translating these poems?
Well, I hope and I think that even before the step of getting down to translate this poem with the students, the first thing that remained, the first lesson, had to do with empathy, at being touched by the poems and therefore trying to communicate this kind of empathy. You know, the idea of literature being a sort of privilege means to communicate such an experience and going beyond the short-lived strategic sentimentalism, I'm quoting Roger Bromley here, that usually characterizes journalism or even sometimes sociological essays on issues like refugees. So the ability to feel empathy and to communicate empathy, I hope, was lesson number one. You know, there's an Italian poet called Patrizia Cavalli who published quite recently in 2020 a new collection of poems. And one of these poems goes, thought that does not feel, does not think for real. Il pensiero che non sente, non pensa veramente. Again, about the value of empathy. And then, of course, there was the effort to translate the poems, but maybe I'll tell something more later on, so I won't talk too much.
Yeah, so, and then going back to the issues that are the subject of Overland Oversea. I remember Trevor talking about how his poem Yala came about, and maybe you could say something about it, Trevor.
Hi, Ambrose. It started, so be back in the, I can't remember whether it was the spring or summer of 2015 when I was on a beach in Cornwall, and just watching that there were my daughter, some nieces and nephews were playing in the sea, and there was kids in the sea in little rubber boats. And then it was that evening went back to the kind of rented flat near the beach and saw people coming over the Mediterranean in, it was the first time that I'd seen it on the 6 o'clock news. and it was just that it was that disconnect between the kids I was seeing on a British beach in an afternoon, and then what I was seeing on the television at 6 o'clock in the Mediterranean. And then I think I saw an interview with somebody who'd successfully managed to make it across the Mediterranean, and what struck me was the tenacity or resilience that they'd shown, and they talked about the experience of being not just coming across in a rubber boat, but the experience of having to negotiate with smugglers in Turkey, I think it was. So that all came together in Yala. Yeah.
And would you be okay to give us a reading?
Yeah, yeah. Find my page. Yala is a Middle Eastern word, I understand, that kind of translates as kind of allez in French, let's go, or kind of more local, because I'm from Nottingham, kind of let's get on with this kind of thing. So yeah, Yala. Shadowed by fissured rock, fingers funneling cooling sand, the pull of the moon carving the rhythm I need to pierce the gloom, smell the horizon, taste futures. I hunker down, take soft hand to hand as she quietly asks, who hears, who sees, will land touch us? Night folds in. Of course I laugh, the stars listen, the moon sees, new land will find us. Yalla. Yet another dawn, chin to chest, rib to rib, my last daughter curved in my lap, exposed to a firmament fully intent on pressing our shared breath to the depths. I raise my trailed palm, cool my brow, wrinkled fingers stroking dreams, residue, all at odds with the tides. Does anyone tune into the stars? Who cares what the moon sees? Will land reach out? Yalla, yalla.
Thank you. And then I think from there, if we go to the Italian translation.
Ok. Yalla. All'ombra di rocce sgretolate, la sabbia fresca che scorre fra le dita, l'attrazione della luna a scolpire il ritmo che mi serve per penetrare le tenebre, annuso l'orizzonte, assaggio i futuri. Mi accovaccio per prendere con mano la morbida mano e lei domanda calma, chi sente, chi vede, ci toccherà la terra? La notte si ripiega su se stessa. Ovvio, rido io. Le stelle ascoltano, la luna vede, nuova terra ci troverà. Yallà. Tuttavia un'altra alba, mento sul petto, costola a costola. La mia ultima figlia mi si accuccia in grembo, esposta a un firmamento tutto intento a premere fino in fondo il nostro respiro condiviso. Alzo il palmo con le sue linee, mi rinfresco la fronte, dita rugose ad accarezzare sogni, tutti residui in disaccordo con le maree. C'è qualcuno che si sintonizza con le stelle? A chi importa quel che vede la luna? Verrà incontro la terra? Yallah, Yallah. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Monica?
Hai! La umbra unor stânci crăpate, cernem nisipul răcoros. Chemarea lunii decupează ritmul de care am nevoie să răzbat prin noapte, să adulmec orizontul, să gust viitorul. Mă așez pe vine și iau în mâna mea mâna ei fină, care întreabă încet. Ne aude cineva? Ne vede? Ne va mângâia pământul? Se lasă noaptea, surâd firește, ne ascultă stelele, luna ne vede, pământul nou ne va găsi, haide! Vin iarăși zorii și cu bărbia în piept, unii lângă alții, fata mea cea mică mi se cuibărește în brațe, expusă unui firmament decis ca aerul pe care îl respirăm, să-l respirăm adânc. Ridic palma brăzdată, îmi răcoresc sprânceana, cu degete zbârcite mângâi vise, cu toate sedimentele în contra mării. E cineva în armonie cu stelele? Cui îi pasă de ce vede luna? Pământul ne va ajuta? Hai, hai!
Thank you. And then maybe if you could tell us, something about the choices that you made in translating Yala and also Insurrection of Poetry.
I haven't thought about this in detail, but I tried to follow the rhythm, to keep the same number of syllables, for example, and to choose words that have similar letters, if possible. Now, sometimes it's not possible because languages have words coming from different parts. The title, I wasn't sure about the title at the beginning, but then I realized it's this word that we say when we want someone to come with us, no? Yala. Okay. Yes, that's it. And about the other poem, I liked the organization of the poems, and I see that the third stanza is very powerful through this repetition of people, factors of influence, and then the last one is a silencer. I mean, it's about the silencers. So, yeah. These poems were not very hard to translate into Romanian. So free verse, of course, it's a little bit easier.
How about you, Pietro?
I think that Barbara Saunders would like to say something about the title, Yalla.
Yeah, so what we will do is if you talk about the choices that you made, and then we bring in Barbara, and then we'll bring in Trevor.
I think that the greatest obstacle to translate these two and the other poems as well, but these two are quite good examples of what I want to say, is that when you translate a collection of different authors, you need to change your mental approach at almost every single page, because every poet has got its own sensitivity and register and so on and so forth. So it could be quite a pain in the neck for the translator, if I may say so. But on the other hand, if you're using a book like this for teaching literary translation, that's just, in a way, the perfect book, because it's the best way to show students and to make students work on something that is, the living evidence that, poetry is the most diverse and multifaceted thing that you can think of, that not every poem is lyrical. That's one of the commonplaces of the stereotypes that we tend to have here in Italy, at least, the idea that every poem must be lyrical, which is not always the case. So, for instance, Yalla by Trevor Wright is very lyrical, almost visionary in its relationship with nature. But at the same time, you have Chris Salt's The Insurrection of Poetry, whose middle section is very lyrical, and then it switches to a sort of political manifesto, if I can say that. I'm not sure Chris might agree with me, but you have to switch your register completely. So it's a good training exercise for the intellectual muscle of a literary translator. The need to always, you know, to keep your guard and don't necessarily take things for granted. As for the title, I'm a great fan of foreignizing approaches to translation. So Yalla remained Yalla. It couldn't be translated.
And Barbara?
Oh yes, thank you. Hello. I only wanted to say I lived in a country for 13 years where Yalla was spoken as the word. Not you spoke Arabic. It had passed into the language, and it was not translated as anything else. And I would say it is so. I would agree with Pietro, and I would say also that to Trevor, you're right about aller, but it's like on y va. But I would say it's even more than that. It's more like here you are. It's come on, let's do it. But it's also here you are. Take it. So it's all of those things. That's my experience of the word for 13 years. Thank you.
Which country was this?
That was Israel. So whether or not you spoke Arabic, Yalla was everywhere. So it was not just amongst the Palestinians, but amongst the Israelis, whether or not they were Sephardi Jews who would have come originally, their families would have come from Arabic-speaking countries, but also the Ashkenazi Jews. Everybody uses Yalla, and it's not translated. It's not translatable. Sorry, I don't mean to be so dogmatic about it. I just mean, in my experience, it was not translated.
It's okay, Yalla.
Excuse me?
It's okay, Yalla.
Yalla is what everybody said.
Yeah.
Everybody said Yalla. It was one of the gifts of the language.
Yeah. There's another one, isn't there?
There's many words have passed into Hebrew from Arabic.
Yeah. Yes. Trevor, yes.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
It's okay. It's okay. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
No, it's fascinating because I stole it, and my understanding of it from a musician who some people might know called Joe Strummer, and it was in a song that was kind of liberation focused. But then one of my first translations was into Farsi by somebody who's in a Nottingham collective called World Jam, who's Iranian. And she said, oh, like we use it in a slightly different way to the way that you've used it. And then I read it at something at Nottingham Poetry Festival, and a young woman from Lebanon came up to me afterwards and said, oh, it's really nice to hear that word in this country.
And of course, the Iranians don't speak Arabic, they speak Farsi.
Yeah, and it was a Farsi translation that one of the first ones that I had. And then the young woman from Lebanon was saying that her mum used to use it exactly as you've just said. Her mum had something like 50 uses for that one word.
Absolutely, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, and it depended on whether the young woman was actually being praised or being scolded or being told off quite strongly.
How you say it.
It's like that 50 words for snow kind of thing. Yeah, it was fascinating. And in other versions that I had, there was one in a friend did it in Welsh for me, and we really struggled with the genders because I didn't want the parent to be gendered, but in Welsh that's really hard because some words do have different endings or beginnings because of the gender. And then we did a version in British Sign Language, and that was painful because sign language is more about emotion than lyricism. So I had it's all changes. I mean, it's the old thing about once it's out there, it's with the person that's listening to it, isn't it? It's out of my control. And apologies because that's the plumber, so I'll mute.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank
Monica, Monica, excuse me. Is yala a word that's ever heard in Romania?
I haven't heard it, so that's why I thank you now that you can clarify it. Yeah, thank you.
I may not be right for other countries, but certainly that was my experience. That's all.
There may be it may be used in local Arabic communities or other communities of people who know these languages. So, but I haven't heard it myself. So. Thank you again for explaining it.
Maybe at this point, I invite people who've got questions. If you've got questions, maybe now is the time. I've got a question for Sibu. You also made choices, didn't you, when you were translating your great aunt's poem from German into English?
Yes. Her poem rhymes. She was born in the latter years of the 19th century, and so she very much came from a tradition of rhymed verse or formal verse as well. So she did not write free verse. She drew on sometimes on song lyrics, German poems, people like sort of Goethe and Rilke. So I think when I was translating, I felt you can take the poems, you can't, if you do a strictly literal translation, you're writing very, very ugly prose. I think one of the other sort of, I was actually listening to something about Elena Ferrante, and I sort of thought, much earlier today, and I'd always thought, well, translating prose must be easier. But actually, Ferrante's translator was saying, you don't do it word by word. You've got to kind of go with the general rhythm of the sentences and the shape and almost, the music of the prose. So I felt that what I was doing was trying to respect my great aunt's musicality, the almost the sort of formal but slightly playful nature of the poetry, even though I might have to sort of push the meaning at various points. I mean, I tried to be faithful to the spirit of the poem, but that didn't always mean being faithful to the letter of it. So that was, I mean, I would agree with what my sort of translation colleagues saying. So some poems are perhaps easier, some poems will work with you and some seem to be kind of almost working against you. I think each poem is different, because my great aunt wrote quite a lot of poems, but it's just one of them, obviously, that's in this anthology.
Paula, did you want to say something? Did you want to add something?
Me? No.
Yeah. No. Okay. All right.
Thank you. But I agree with the things which were just said. I myself, I translated a lot of poetry from English into Italian, and I agree. You can't really make a rule, you know, about deciding whether you're translating literally. You have to think, yes, the language, yes, of course, but the rhythm first of all. And English and Italian have such, they're so different in the rhythm and in the word, the length of the words and everything. So it's you have to invent in a way a language as you go, and always keeping in mind that you have to respect the text, of course, because this is not your text, it's a translation, but I mean, it's a lot to do to recreate it. I appreciate the book very much that you put together, Ambrose. I mean, we don't know each other. I'm here, I find myself here by chance because I just responded that something that arrived by mail. I don't know whether it was through Pietro, I'm not sure. But anyway, yes, thank you. But I mean, so I thought I was just, I was not becoming, you know, part of this panel, of this discussion. But anyway, I was very, very struck by this book, although I've only seen the Italian translation, you know, but I was really interested. Yeah.
The English version is much better, believe me.
The English original, you mean? Yeah. Yes, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yes, and
can I just say hello? I'm sorry I was late. I had a medical appointment. I'm very lucky to have a poem in the original book, which I'm not a real poet really, but it happened by chance. And I know Ross very well from Five Leaves Bookshop, and spent when it first came out, spent ages going around with stacks of the book in my bag, selling them to everybody I could, because I feel so passionate about it. And I love what you've done, Ambrose. I came to one when you first had translations done. I came to the event in Leicester to hear some of the readings, and I'm not a linguist. I cannot do languages at all, but I love hearing them. And I just love this sense that you can bring the intent through. You know, I like what you said, Sybil, about musicality. But also I think the intent of the poem and also the intent of the collection, you know, it's just marvelous that so many years on, it's still got this life and is moving into different communities, you know, with this sort of original purpose still underpinning it. Sad we still need it so desperately. So I really am very grateful to all the people who've given time in translation, and it's just wonderful to hear you with the different languages and how seriously you take that translation process. But it also, hopefully, a bit of the translator gets in there as well, and it just passes on a wider intent into the new community with the new language.
What do you say to that, Pietro and Monica? That a little bit of you also goes into the poems that you translate.
Yeah, definitely. It was much easier when we were translating together collectively with the students. When you're left on your own to translate, you always, you know, feel the need for someone to read and listen and tell you, you know, it's okay, it works well, it's fine. Whereas during the collective work, it was not only myself in the poem, but at the same time, the contributions were much more numerous and richer, I would say. And especially, you know, Sibyl was mentioning rhyming poems, especially when we had to choose words to keep the rhyme patterns. That was the hardest part. And that was also the moment when I realized that my students' brains were much fresher and clever and quick, because they came up with brilliant solutions sometimes. I was really grateful for that. So yeah, there is something of me, but also something of many other students who worked on some of the poems in a way.
Yes, I had a similar experience. My students are usually first-year students, Some of them were bright. They could bring interesting solutions, interesting translation solutions. We translated in the classroom only some of the poems, not all the poems. They liked the poems with rhyme, the rhyming poems, but for them it was a little bit difficult. As far as I'm concerned, I am a person, I have a personality somehow that is open to diversity. So I like it when one page is in one way, another page, another style, another page, another style. So for me, it was like a feast. Regarding the rhyming poems, I believe that any rhyming poem can be translated in general. So it takes more, but I think it is possible. So for with some of these poems, it took me, let's say, 1 week or 2 weeks to finish a rhyming poem, or maybe more, because sometimes it was hard to find a perfect rhyme or an acceptable rhyme, a good rhyme. Sometimes I had to adapt the meaning, to reshape the meaning a little bit. But I think it is worth in the end.
And then maybe, carry on.
I just wanted to say that when we translate a rhyming verse from English into Romanian, in Romanian we seem to have more syllables. So we need. One thing that I have to do is to find shorter words, and yeah, so to keep the rhythm. Yeah. Yes, that's it.
And what was your experience with word length, Pietro, when you're translating from English into Italian? Are the words generally the same length, or?
Yeah, Paula was right when she said that Italian words are usually longer. And it became a real problem with poems like Rod Duncan's But One Country, because that is also, amongst other things, a kind of concrete poem, and you have to respect the shape that the lines create on the page. So sometimes the solutions were very, very fit in terms of meaning and sound, but the line was too long, so it couldn't be employed. But I mean, generally speaking, it is a problem you find when you translate from English into Italian, because English has got a quality of, a density, a sureness that Italian doesn't have. And it's not always easy to find an equivalence between the two.
And then maybe at this point, what we will do is we'll hear Sibyl read her great aunt's poem in German, and then the German translation, the German original will be followed by an Italian translation and Romanian translation. Okay. We will not read the English version. We just use the languages.
Yeah. Okay. It's actually got a Latin title to add to the general kind of linguistic diversity. And I do get a bit nervous reading in German because it's not a language that I was sort of brought up speaking, but I'll give it a go. Vale Terzin. Und wieder reißt das Schicksal auf die Tür und stößt uns nun hinaus mit harter Hand. Wie schon so oftmals in der letzten Zeit, in Neuland uns noch fremd und unbekannt. Es trieb uns aus der alten Heimat fort, versetzte uns so manchen harten Schlag. Fast war man schon geborgen im KZ, wohin der Weg uns jetzt vollführen mag. Wir wissen nicht, was draußen vor sich geht, wo unsere Lieben sind, wer da noch lebt. Man ist so wund geworden, dass man schon bloß im Gedanken an Gewissheit bebt.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you wanted to go on to the translations now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So either Monica or Pietro.
Monica?
La revedere, Theresienstadt. Deci soarta se pregătește să ne evacueze. Bate la ușa de la intrare cu mâna ei oficială. Nu este prima oară. Mă vor strămuta încă o dată spre noi păduri, spre locuri noi, teren necunoscut. Destinul ne-a evacuat din toate casele. Ne-a dat afară, ne-a snopit în bătaie cu pumnii. Începusem să credem că viața în tabără e sigură. Acum, drumul din fața noastră e nesigur. E plin de meandre, întortocheate. Nimeni nu știe ce se întâmplă afară, unde sunt familiile noastre, dacă au fost cruțați. Am devenit slabi. Chiar și numai gândul de a ni se ghici viitorul ne face să tremurăm. Atât suntem desperiați.
Addio Teresin. Così la fortuna ha pianificato la nostra espulsione. Bussa alla porta d'ingresso con mano guantata. Non è la prima volta questa. Ancora ci spostano verso teneri boschi, nuovi pascoli, terra sconosciuta. Il fato ci ha sfrattati dalle nostre case di prima, ci ha presi a calci, riempiti di botte. Dentro al campo pensavamo quasi di essere al sicuro. Adesso la via è incerta, piene di curve le rotte e di svolte. Nessuno sa che succede fuori, dove sono le nostre famiglie, se i cari sono stati risparmiati. Siamo diventati deboli. Il solo pensiero di farci dire il futuro ci fa tremare. Fino a questo punto siamo spaventati.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you also want to say something about where the poem came from, Sibyl, the context?
Yes, of course. It was written by my great aunt, who was a German Jew, and in 1944, she did not manage to leave Germany. There was a last-minute hitch, and so, you know, after the outbreak of the Second World War, her situation became more and more difficult. But in 1944, they came for her and they took her to the concentration camp, the ghetto at Theresienstadt, where she worked as a slave labourer. I mean, as the war was not, she managed to avoid, there were deportations to Auschwitz from Theresienstadt, but because she was a slave labourer, she was useful. So she was spared deportation, and, you know, so she lived and the camp was liberated. And the poem would have been written, I think, in about May 1945. The campus, I think, was liberated by the Russians. And obviously this was a joyous and longed for event. But I mean, you know, they didn't know what would happen next. They didn't know whether their children, you know, were still alive, what fate awaited them. So it was, in some ways, a very, very frightening time. It wasn't like going back to the old safe world. I think it was a time of great vulnerability. There's a sort of word wund towards the end, which is a bit, I think, related to the English word wound. You know, you're raw. So it's, many of her poems are actually very humorous. They are sort of set because, in a bizarre way, I think the way in which she sort of survived the conditions there, which were grim and terrible. A lot of people died from malnutrition and so on. I mean, she wrote light verse in a way, sort of sending the place up. I imagine she committed them to memory. They were transcribed later. There were poetry competitions at Theresienstadt, but I think some of them were typed up later at the camp for displaced persons that was where she went to. And one of her two sons did survive, and she was eventually found. He found her, so her story had a happy ending. But anyway, that's the story of the poem.
Thank you very much. And also, Sibu, Sally. Sorry, Sally wanted to ask a question. Do you want to ask your question, Sally?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm just intrigued by translating poetry. It seems to me such a difficult task. And I wondered how you go about it, if you've got different ways, methodologies of doing it. Do you do it a line at a time? Do you look at a stanza? Do you try and sit down and do the whole thing in one go to capture the poet's voice even? I'm just interested in the process. I wondered if we could ask that question to the translators. Would that be possible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Shall I answer first? Yeah?
Yes.
Hi, Sally. Thanks for your question. Yeah, I would say first rough version, all in one go, and then I go back to it, trying to, you know, work on details and rhythm and sounds more closely. You know, one of the reasons why I really like to translate poetry over prose is very practical, because in translating poetry, I can still work with pen and paper.
Oh, yes.
You can't do that if you translate a novel, because otherwise you waste too much time to copy it, to type it as a second step. But whereas if you write it, you know, on a piece of paper and then you type it, when it's a poem, I mean, there's not much time involved, so it's not a problem at all. And I have this like more physical relationship with the first version of what I translate. I don't know if that answers your question, but anyway.
Yeah, that's really interesting that it's a very sort of detailed, particular, intense process, it seems to me. So, yeah, thank you.
Indeed, there are several stages we take into account when we translate not only poems, literature in general. I also have a first version of a poem and I translate it, trying to get the meaning. Sometimes it's difficult to get the meaning even in this stage. If the poem is more elliptical, for example, and this collection includes several poems that are elliptical, they have usually a traumatic event that inspired the poem. So in that case, I exchanged emails with some of the poets. And then, of course, after this first draft, there are other factors, like if a word is the best word in the, for example, a noun or an adjective, or maybe an expression. And then the rhythm, if the rhythm is similar to the one in the original. And then the whole impression is also important, or maybe impressions that appear with each and every line. Usually I think I read the poems that I translate maybe at least 20 times before finding the best version. And it is also important to read it out, not only to write it.
Yeah. So it almost sounds as if you go through the same process as the poet did, in a way, you know, that attention to every word, the best adjective, but also you're thinking about the overall narrative structure as well, I guess, and that's, you've got to capture that as well. It seems a really difficult task to me. I just write poetry, I don't translate it, so I'm interested in how you interpret things word for word. Yeah.
I mean, with me, that there's a sort of maybe an added layer in that I'm not a German speaker, so though sort of some reading knowledge of German has actually come through this activity of translation. But my mother, who was born in Germany, who left just before her 11th birthday, provided me with a literal translation of the text. So I was working partly with that and partly with the look of the poems. And my starting point, one of the things I also do is teach creative writing, and one of the things that drives me absolutely mad when I sort of, it's more like assessing manuscripts and helping to sort of support people who try to write poetry, is when people write rhymed poetry that doesn't scan. They just sort of plonk the sort of rhyming words in random places at the ends of the line. I mean, I think if you're writing a metrical poem, it has to work. And my great aunt's poetry scans perfectly. She knew the rules. So I thought, well, I've got to try and do her justice. I mean, you know, for God knows, the poor woman was a slave labourer, you know, in her 60s. The least I can do is try and respect her poems. So then, really, the first thing I was looking at was, you know, the sort of structure in terms of, yes, the first and third lines rhyme, second and fourth rhyme. And I was very much working with rhyming dictionary. So it was about rhyme and it was about metre. And it was almost like trying to do a particularly hard cryptic crossword puzzle, but it was great. With some poems, I wouldn't say they defeated me, but some I was less happy with the translations, and with other I felt I've got something that works in its own right. It's a sort of, it's almost like I want to do it so you wouldn't know it was a translation. It will just sort of stand on its own feet.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah. So there's all those layers to unwrap, isn't there, when you're doing it? And it must be an emotional experience, especially for you, I would think, and quite exhausting.
I think for me, I'm sort of interested to know with the other translators. There's something about doing something really hard is bizarrely soothing. I mean, it was like I just get so obsessed with making the words work, and possibly in the same way as if I were writing poems in English, that other things would leave my mind. And I suspect for my great aunt, when she was writing the originals, it would distract her from, you know, things like hunger, and actually a lot of the work she was doing was very boring and monotonous, or she was cold. And I just imagine the poems, that business of putting the words together, making the rhymes, must have been something that might have sort of soothed her, or if she recited them to other people and they laughed, you know, it was about a sort of shared joy and connection. So
yeah, and a form of escapism, I expect, from the, you know, the awful situation. When you write, you can go where you like, can't you, and that in your imagination. So yeah, there's part of that there too. So thank you. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
And we've also got a question from Chris.
Yes, I read the question. The answer, Chris, is no. I never even tried. I never felt the fire, the urge, whatever we call it. And I enjoy reading real poetry too much to waste my time like that. For asking anyway. It was very kind of you.
Well, I was asking because I'm particularly fond of Don Patterson's versions of Rilke. And if you go back to the original, I mean, I think the only way you could describe them is versions, and yet they do become poems in their own right, because he is a fine poet himself. And I just wondered if is our other translator. I sorry, I haven't got her name in front of me. Does she write poetry or not? Where is she? Romanian.
Yes, I also write poetry. Yes.
Ah.
Okay, so somehow, so I've been written poetry since high school, let's say. But when I was in faculty foreign languages, somehow I tried to write again. So to write poetry again, and because we studied and translated poetry in faculty. So indeed, it's important to find the source of fire in the poem.
That's a lovely way of. That's a brilliant way of putting it.
Yes, and the picture. Sometimes poems are visual, and sometimes poems don't describe geographical or maybe physical realms. Some poems describe imaginary settings, and you need to find that kind of setting to project the same way.
It's interesting listening to the translations, because certainly what Pietro would describe as my manifesto, and I guess it kind of is. Even in Arabic, or the last words, and in Romanian and in Italian, they all seem to land the same, which really interested me. I suppose Italian always ends in sort of O, and well, what are they? I've lost it somewhere. Yeah. So
the last word, you mean?
Yeah, occupied, racist, persecutor, crucifiers, liars, manipulators. In Arabic also, they all land in exactly the same way as they landed in Italian. Which I don't, and also in Romanian, which is also a bit rusty. But yeah, I'm very impressed. It's wonderful to hear your poem in another language. So thank you ever so much. It's great.
I've been trying to write some poems in English, but for me it's a little bit more difficult.
Send some, please send some. Send some to me. I'll put my email here, and you can send some.
Okay.
Oh, it's probably on the mass email that Ambrose sent. I'd love to see those. You won't see any of my Romanian ones, I'm afraid. I kept them locked away.
And then, interestingly, what you're saying about poets and translators. A friend of mine translated one of my poems into Shona, and if I was compared to what I'd written, comparing the two, I think his version was actually an improvement on mine.
It is always
it was an improvement in the sense that he wrote it, he translated it the way a Shona poet would. He gave it, he rendered it into poetry in Shona. Whereas if I translated my own poem, I would have done it word for word, which doesn't have the same effect. And interestingly, the question, the statement that you've put, that that writing poetry is never a waste of time, whatever the outcome. It also reminds, it's not. We know what you mean, Pietro. So this.
Bruce, we have to apologize for this by the end of this conversation.
No, you don't.
No, I'm kidding.
you don't.
Did it suffer in the translation?
What I was going to do is I was going to link that statement with another statement that also influenced Overland Oversea and the translation effort, where one of the EU, I think it was the EU president at the time, said, talking about the crisis of leadership in Europe around migration, where he said that now is not the time for poetry. Now is the time for action. And what Overland, Oversea, and also the translations and the uses that we are putting both to, what they show is that poetry is capable of action, that poetry is a form of action, that, possibly when it works, it has the capacity, the ability to move, to change things, which is also part of what is driving all of us here, that we want something different. We are expecting different from leadership in Europe, especially in terms of how they are responding to the refugee, what they're calling the refugee crisis, which is actually, in effect, a crisis of leadership by governments in Europe. It's totally unacceptable that governments in Europe are letting people drown in the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea. It's totally unacceptable that governments in Europe are pushing back people to Libya, to detention centers there, where people are being abused by militias that are being funded by European governments. So it was a digression.
I think I feel both. I don't think it's a sort of simple question, in that I think poetry can be an activist activity, and I think what you're doing with the anthology is a wonderful example of it. I mean, I'm very aware at the moment when I just find life profoundly distressing in all sorts of ways because of the failure of leadership and I think the erosion of democracy, that I will also use artistic activity in quite a different way to sort of cocoon myself and go into a kind of almost like a sort of fantasy world or a different space or whatever. So I think poetry is, I mean, there are an awful lot of people, poets who say, no, this is an art form and it's not about public engagement. Poetry mustn't sort of dumb itself down and speak in slogans. I think there's a lot of tensions about, it's very hard to sort of seek a definition of what poetry is and insist that all poetry is relevant and contains good social messages. I think projects about translation, though, inevitably are about improving cultural understanding and cooperation. That's all.
Does anyone want to add anything to at this point?
Yes, I would.
Yes.
I actually think that poetry is many things simultaneously. So you might be writing it and feeling as if you're in a cocoon, and yet if you share it, it may somehow affect someone else to think that actually it's not in a cocoon, it communicates very deeply. That same thing that you feel is so private and even escapist may affect someone else very deeply, and you may not even, you may not even think of it that way. And in different ways, with different intentions and different interpretations. In fact, it may even have a social effect. When as I said, I don't think of myself as a real poet, right? But I think that, and when I wrote what I wrote, it was long before there was a call out for contributions. I'm not thinking specifically of that one, but in general, I guess I would write first for myself, but at the same time, it sends me to other poets. It sends me to develop myself, I hope, as a person. I think that's never ending. And I guess I might be in some way a better person for having been part of this project. I feel a better person. I was deeply frustrated, as everybody else is here, by what was going on. It was a slight relief to share that. The book bears reading and rereading, I think. I think some of the poems are amazing in here. So I think that we can't just say it's social action or I'm sorry, I tend to come across as dogmatic, but I mean that we can be many things simultaneously. We can be writing for ourselves, and that may at the same time turn into social action. And they do say that it's very hard to write poems purely for social action, that actually they may not come across as very much poetry. So if you see what I mean. So our intentions may meander a little. That's all.
Hi.
Caroline, yes.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I've been following the Arab uprising since 2010. And one of the most striking, and they've been carrying on until, just up to the pandemic started, moving around the region, as it were. But one of the most striking things about those uprisings is that their chosen form of expression has been poetic, poetry and song especially. And it hasn't been an ideological form of expression. And what was really interesting was that poetry in that circumstance, it was felt to be both a collective language, the language of all our stories and what binds us together, and yet at the same time, people said that what they found was that each one felt valued. So it wasn't a collective homogeneity; it was a collective circumstance in which everyone felt valued, and that was somehow connected to the poetic expression. And so Chris, I especially enjoyed your poem in the context of that, the fact that poetry and revolutions and uprisings have a kind of, they go together.
Yes, and I've just put poetry is action on the chat, but I was just looking what I meant, and I just looked up the dictionary definition. It says the fact or process of doing something typically to achieve an aim. And I think that's right. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a political aim. It might be an emotional aim. It might be to say, look, this is what I feel. Isn't that how you feel as well? Shine some light into a dark corner of understanding, a shared understanding. So I think it is action, but not action in necessarily the sense of political action. Although, having mentioned Iraq, I have written a book called Home Front, Front Line, which is all about that atrocious period of our history. So, and I hope that communicates, and I've read it a lot. So yeah, I agree entirely. Thanks for your nice comment.
And Laila, I think Laila has also edited and published a book on poetry and human rights. Maybe you could say something about it.
Yeah, sure. So there was a collection I worked on in 2012, 2013, absolutely ages ago, called 101 Poems for Human Rights. And we got entries from all over the world. And the title was very broad because we were just interested to see what people would write about when we said human rights. And we ended up having chapters on the environment, on child rights, on war, on women's rights, on sort of land rights, indigenous land rights. We ended up having 10 chapters worth of material, and some work in translation as well. We weren't really set up to properly have a multi-language translation piece. And I think unknown to us, actually, one of the poems in Chinese was actually mistranslated, which someone only told me years ago. And I guess retrospectively, having some translators on board would have been fantastic. But yeah, we really learned a huge amount about the different ways that you can approach the issue. So you're not speaking about a human rights issue in a sort of dogmatic, preachy way, which just makes people shut the book. No one likes being told what to think. You need an interesting story, an unexpected angle. You had some poems which took the opinion of the oppressor, and you initially read them and it's quite strange, but if you use characters, you can expose lots of really interesting issues there. But yeah, I think if we had aligned ourselves with some translators at the start, then that could have taken the book to some really interesting places. We weren't expecting to get texts in other languages, and I think, yeah, it's having the resources for something like that as well. I think another interesting angle with that was that we got this book together, huge response, some really beautiful poetry. And then I found out that the University of London, that particular department, published books, but didn't have a marketing team. So it was sort of buried in the University of London website. And there was no plan or funding to promote it. So I had to just kind of start a tour myself and look for funding to do that. Yeah, that's another thing, another learning lesson. Check that you can have some marketing support as well. Otherwise you have a beautiful thing with nowhere to go.
Thank you. And then I think to build on this, especially what you said about poems that take the language of the oppressor, I think this is a good point to bring in Rod Duncan's poem, which is about a view which starts with a voice that sounds xenophobic, but then turns it round. How we are going to do it is we're going to do it through, I'm going to share an adaptation or a translation of Rod Duncan's But One Country. Is a translation in the sense that it has been, the poem has been turned into a film, into a short film. So I'm going to share that now, and then we go to Kevin's poem. Okay.
Oh, we can't hear?
Sorry, let's see if I increase my volume, if that improves. Can you hear that?
No.
No.
I think there's something when you hit share where it says use computer sound.
Okay, let me look for it.
Anyone else who's used Zoom before might know as well. I'm trying to remember what the button is, but I think I had this myself once.
Okay, let me look for it.
Yeah, I don't know in this, Ambrose, but in Teams, there's a little thing that flashes when you put your cursor at the top that says share system sound.
Okay.
Where it is in Zoom.
Okay, so share computer sound, yeah?
Yeah, or system.
Yep, that sounds.
Okay, let's try.
refugee from Iran and I volunteer my time to Amorter, Greece because they help other refugees like me.
Can you hear that? Hello?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. So
I'm a refugee from Iran and I volunteer my time to Amorter, Greece because they help other refugees like me. This poem is called But One Country. Our home is but one country. Truly, the whole earth is there for them to settle. Tell us if you can, where else shall we go when they have come? They do not belong in our homeland. You should blush when you say to us, we must turn our vision upside down. We must turn our vision upside down. You should blush when you say to us, they do not belong in our homeland. Shall we go when they have come? Tell us if you can. Where else is there for them to settle? Truly, the whole earth is but one country, our home.
yeah. So that was Rod Duncan's But One Country. Yeah. So yeah, so that was Rod Duncan's But One Country. Well, you had Pietro and Monica. You had experiences with the poem.
Yeah, that was the poem we started with. The very first poem we translated during the seminar. And it was useful because it immediately taught us that we had, as the poem said, to turn our vision upside down for translating all these poems. I mean, putting yourself into someone else's shoes, embracing his point or her point of view is what translators do all the time, is what literature does all the time, and it is a foundation of humanity. So it was the perfect start in a way. Not easy, I'm not saying it was easy, on the contrary, but very appropriate to begin, yeah.
And Monica, what was your experience?
In my case, it was one of the poems I translated at the beginning for the Journeys in Translation. I don't remember if I worked on it with my students, but I really liked deciphering it and solving the puzzle, because it is like a puzzle. I liked the message. I liked the ingenious volta in the middle of the poem, the big change, in the second part, I mean, in the second stages, in the second stage, I worked on making sure that the language in the first part is exactly the same with the language in the second part. And I, of course, like in English, it's about, so the words are the same, but the tonality is different. So the intonation and the tonality are different.
Maybe we could hear but one country in Italian and then Romanian.
Yes, that's all. Yeah. And Romanian, okay.
Yeah.
Will we move to rehabilitation clinic or not?
O singură țară. Acasă este o singură țară. Adevărat. Întreg pământul e ca oricine să-și găsească loc. Spuneți-ne dacă puteți, în ce parte să ne mai deplasăm atunci când vin. Dar ei nici nu sunt de pe aceste meleaguri. Nu vă îmbujorați chiar deloc când ne spuneți să ne schimbăm cu totul punctul de vedere? Să ne schimbăm cu totul punctul de vedere. Nu vă îmbujorați chiar deloc când ne spuneți, dar ei nici nu sunt de pe aceste meleaguri, să ne mai deplasăm atunci când vin? Spuneți-ne, dacă puteți, în ce parte e ca oricine să-și găsească loc. Adevărat, întreg pământul este o singură țară, acasă.
Thank you, thank you.
Un unico paese. Casa nostra è un unico paese. Davvero, la terra intera può essere un posto per loro. Diteci se voi potete, dove altro dovremmo andarcene se arrivano? Loro non appartengono alla nostra terra. Dovreste vergognarvi quando ci dite che dobbiamo capovolgere il nostro punto di vista. Dobbiamo capovolgere il nostro punto di vista. Dovreste vergognarvi quando ci dite che loro non appartengono alla nostra terra. Dovremmo andarcene se arrivano? Diteci, se voi potete, dove altro può essere un posto per loro? Davvero, la terra intera è un unico paese, casa nostra.
Thank you. Maybe we go to Kevin now.
Thank you.
Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Ambrose. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I have a repetitive strain injury, which is why I haven't participated in the chat. So apologies if I've seemed very taciturn. I'm a poet. Why am I a poet? Because it's about expression. I think it's much more, though. It's about reminding one another of the work of listening. And I use the word work very deliberately. I think we live in a world which is impoverishing our quality of listening. And in doing so, it is disconnecting us and allowing politicians and the media to manipulate us in ever more sinister ways. So poetry, I think, has a unique ability to defend itself against that sort of dehumanization and desensitization. It's possible to say things in ways which reach people's hearts, as we've mentioned, but I think it's also possible to re-engage our listening and realize that that's something that we have to keep working on. My particular angle on refugee acceptance within our world is as a queer person, as a gay man, there is a sort of niche within the world of people seeking refuge, which is because of their sexuality. And that's an increasing issue right across the world. There is a toughening of the stance against homosexuality, often in the name of religion. And one of the things I've been doing in lockdown is rereading Jung. I recommend it. And Jung essentially said that if we don't understand the beast in ourselves and can't be with that beast, we will forever be condemned to project it on others and behave as if we can respond to our own beast by killing others. And effectively, I see that playing out now. I see gay people, queer people being demonized because it's a convenient way of stirring up hate. So I speak very much to that as an individual. Within gatherings which I help to organize of queer people, we always set aside money for those who don't have access, and really try to reach out to them, get them along. And invariably what happens at some stage is that some of these refugees will share their stories. And I guarantee there won't be a single dry eye in that room, whether there's 3 people or 100, because it is that reaching of hearts and the connecting of hearts. So thank you for listening to that. And I'll just share my poem, which is The Last Rain of the Season. And I suppose this was an empathic act, really. I tried to imagine what a refugee might feel, the sense of loss, the sense of alienation, the desire to make sense. Last rain of the season. Each empty chair greeted with that sort of touch kept for a childhood pony. Paintbrushes propped in an old honey pot to flower again. The key is heavy, heavy and cold. She turns thoughts to the light pounding at the window for admission or forgiveness, and with a prayer steadies to another day. A snail on the doorstep. She moves it gently, so very gently away. Thank you.
Shall we, so we have Monica and Pietro, and then we'll come back to you again, Kevin, on that poem.
Ultima ploaie a anotimpului. Fiecare scaun gol atins cu acel gest din copilărie, cu care te apropiai de ponei. Pensule de vopsea proptite într-un vechi borcan de miere, ca să înflorească din nou. Cheia este grea, grea și rece. Femeia stă și se gândește în lumina care bate prin fereastră. Recunoaștere sau iertare, și cu o rugăciune se liniștește pentru încă o zi. Un melc pe pragul ușii îl urnește ușor, atât de ușor. Thank you.
L'ultima pioggia di stagione. Ogni sedia vuota salutata con quella specie di tocco riservato al cavallino dell'infanzia. Pennelli di pittore infilati in un vecchio vasetto del miele per farli rifiorire. La chiave è pesante, pesante e fredda. Lei volta i pensieri verso la luce che batte alla finestra per avere accesso o perdono e con una preghiera si rimette in sesto per un altro giorno. Una lumaca sul gradino di casa, gentile, proprio così gentile. Lei la allontana. Thank you.
So I think for maybe what we'll do with, we'll have a conversation between Kevin, Monica, and Pietro.
One thing I wanted to say to Kevin is that I was really fond of this poem because it is true. I mean, the sense of loss, the sense of alienation of this person being described is really easy to perceive, but at the same time, it sort of turns itself into, you know, giving life to everyday objects, animate them with empathy or feelings, and I really, really appreciated that side of the poem.
Thank you so much, Pietro. It was very fascinating for me to engage with the process and the individuals of translation. This is the first time I'm aware of any poem of mine being translated. So it's a great honor to have that experience. And I'm really touched that you found that there was the detailing of the sort of making meaning out of the daily objects. Because when I was standing in the shoes of this person, I could imagine that every single thing around would need to be imbued with a fresh sense of home and some kind of significance to that individual. I'm glad that comes across.
It did. Thank you.
I liked the poem because of the lack of punctuation. So the lack of punctuation forces the reader to find the breaks, the pauses himself or herself. And I also like this idea of giving life to objects, and it reminded me of the poems of Wallace Stevens, the American poet, and also about you know, there is a theory of transitional objects in psychoanalysis by Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, and I think there is a tradition of poetry that gives life to objects, and this is for a purpose. And it was interesting that you mentioned Jung earlier. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for the poem.
Thank you so much, Monica, for your wonderful translation. I guess what I was just trying to do was help anyone who is struggling with the enormity of thinking about refugees and all the different circumstances and all of the traumas, just trying to find a way that they could make a little connection. You know the butterfly effect, just that point of contact that would get through all of that turmoil and all of that intensity and allow them to feel individually that they could think about and maybe make a difference. That's quite sufficient for me. I don't have any issues as a poet about I own this poem and therefore it means this. To me, I think somebody said it already, you write the poem and it goes out into somebody else's world and it means what it means. But I think each act that we can participate in of communicating is enriching a world. It's the opposite of this effect of homogenizing and polarizing. And so I really applaud every single person who's here for your own writing and for your own contribution to this project and to all the other things that I'm sure you're involved in creatively. And thank you, Ambrose, especially for your enormous energy on this.
I don't want to take too much credit on this. These translations wouldn't have been possible without the poets, you, who agreed to have the work translated, and it also wouldn't have been possible without Monica, Pietro, and the other translators. So I really appreciate the permission, one, and also the work that the translators have been doing. And because of that work, the possibilities now appear almost limitless. And I think we are in a good place. And thank you for that as well. Does anyone have questions? Or comments? Or statements? Or manifestos?
Only to say thank you, Ambrose, for brilliant curating of this session. It's been absolutely fascinating. Really glad I came, and it's lovely to meet everybody and see you again.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. And looking forward to Scotland.
Yes, maybe we could have a reading here.
I look forward to that as well. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ambrose, and all the poets and the translators.
Here, here. Brilliant.
We'll drink to that.
Oh, let's have a drink. That sounds like a good plan.
Yeah.
And happy Christmas, everybody. Have the best possible one.
Yeah. Happy Christmas, everyone.
Yeah. Maybe next year will be better. Let's hope.
It will always be better.
Yeah.
Kevin, you said something which I think is interesting when you were talking about the hate that the media and the politicians are engineering. How do we undo it?
Well, that's such a big question, Ambrose. I think we can, as individuals, probably only do it in small ways, but the essence of it, I would think, is to combat the dehumanization, because it's the same principle that allowed the Nazis to demonize the Jews. It's the removal of individuality. It's the denial of individual stories and truths. And that permits the politicians then to just put one face on something, and that face can be the bad face that they want people to be fearful of. So I think it's slow work and it's steady work, but it's tremendously important. I think it's tremendously important. And I think it's also really important for us to name it. It saddens me that we live in a world of media which does not name the way that hate is used instrumentally by politicians. I really wish I could switch on the PM program on Radio 4 and hear a debate about the impoverishment of our leadership because of the way that they default to using hate in lieu of any positive contributions to our world.
Monica, how do we dismantle the dehumanization, the othering, and also the hate? How do we?
I think private initiatives, community initiatives like this or like others can somehow dismantle this. And speak up whenever it's possible, whenever is necessary, because we have a poet here in Romania. She's almost 80 years old, and during communism, she was at some point she couldn't publish her poems, her books, and I remember one idea that she mentioned in a book of interviews, and she said that if you don't tell about the problem when it's necessary to solve that problem, then it can grow into something that is uncontrollable, cannot be controlled. Yes. So speak at the right time and in the right place with the right people, if possible.
And Trevor.
Yes, and probably to do this, you must be open to new possibilities, because if some roads are closed at some point, you need to take another direction, to take it into another direction. Yeah. And here is where poetry comes in, because you need imagination to do that.
And Trevor, how do we do it?
Oh, I think Kevin and Monica have summed it up really. I've got a phrase tell greater stories than the stories that are burying you. And I know it's only a little thing, like Kevin says, but challenging those stories, those narratives that are oppressing you with stories that are more human. It's not easy, but that's the best I can offer. Greater stories.
And Pietro, how do we change the narrative on, especially on migration?
Well, I very much agree with what Trevor, Kevin, and Monica just said. I think that maybe from a more practical point of view, we should also ensure that leadership is accountable. I mean, in the face of objective reality. When I say that, I have in mind the fact that since a few years ago in Italy, we have some tribunals sentences condemning some of the torturers who worked in the Libyan concentration or detention camps. So the fact that in Libya there is a system of tortures is not just an opinion. In Italy is a legal truth. And it is unacceptable that our leadership behaves as if those sentences did not exist.
Caroline and Dan?
I guess, along with what else has been said, it's important to speak out, and it doesn't actually have to be a poem. It can be writing, to the newspaper or journalistic platforms, because part of this speaking out is also helping to sort of educate others, because it's so difficult to get around the media that we have, and so. Yeah, I just say speak out in whatever way you can.
Is there anyone else who wants to chip in at this point?
I may add, inspired by the film that was made after this poem of Rod Duncan. I think other films like this can be made with the poems, and I think the younger generation who is more prone to using telephones and applications and so on, I think they can do a good job, and I will try to do this with my students to see what they can do with poems and the pictures and the films, short films. Yes. And maybe if we use this video here, maybe sending it to some local organizations, maybe they could do this, starting from the poems existing in this book or in other books, so that people can find more about this. I can say that by translating this book, I have learned more about the NGOs that deal with refugees here in Romania, because before that I wasn't very aware of. I used to read articles, but wasn't very much aware of what exactly they do and how they help people. Yes.
And you wanted to say something?
I feel very unqualified to say anything really, although I feel passionate about all of these things, and like everybody else, very frustrated by the lack of accountability for leadership. I'm doing a very interesting course right at the end of a 7-week course with the Quakers on white privilege and becoming an anti-racist ally, which is something we're very challenged in Quaker circles about at the moment. And I'm hoping to try and bring this training across to our area meeting right across the region I live in. Because it's been wonderful, and what's really struck me is that some of the materials, the tutors used some amazing materials that really challenged and inspired us and moved us. So we're sort of educating ourselves really, and then we're looking at what does this mean to me and how can we support without taking over, without grabbing the mic. But a lot of the material has been poetry, and George the poet we've had, and around Grenfell, and amazing poems from local poets about their experiences, and as well as powerful films like 13th and things like that. And it's it's reminded me of the journey with this book as well a little bit, this sort of sense of, even if you do something tiny, you just have a poem that happens to fit, and you send it in, and you just go around and try and sell a few copies of the book, and you don't feel like you're doing very much, but it's nice to feel part of a bigger community of people who have a similar wish for things to change. And I really value what you've been doing, Ambrose, in allowing us glimpses, and some of the things you've shared that we could sign up to, or talk to our MPs about, because I do write to my MP and stuff, have been very helpful. So I really value being part of this sort of community that's spreading out, and I think that's really important.
So it's now 2 minutes past 6. I think this is where we say thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you've got any suggestions on how we can improve on these conversations, if there were things that you thought you could have done better, you've got my email address. Please drop me a line. Let me know how we do this, how we do it better, if we can, if it's possible. Also, let us know what you liked, and if you're doing other things that are similar that you'd like us to be part of. If you let us know as well, that would be appreciated. So thank you all very much. I hope you have a brilliant and restful festive season, and see you in the new year.
Thank you, Ambrose. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ambrose.
Thank you, Pietro.
Bye-bye.
Great session.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Happy Christmas, everyone.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you.
Happy Christmas.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Monica and Pietro, you've been brilliant.
Okay.
Really brilliant.
Thands.
Yeah.
And it was a nice moment. I liked it.
Yeah. So I look forward to the conversations in the new year, and some of the other plans that we're working on. I think it's going to be good.
Yes.
Yeah. So you stay safe.
You too.
You too.
Take care of yourself and enjoy your festivities. Okay.
Buon Natale.
Buon Natale. Yeah. Buon Natale. How do you say that in Romanian?
Crăciun fericit.
Crăciun fericit.
What does it mean?
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah. So yeah.
Bye.
And we'll catch up soon. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Take care of yourself.
And you, Monica. Bye.
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 Goodbye. Thank you.
See you next time, hopefully.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm glad I was here. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed the session.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I was very interested. And was totally unexpected, as I said. But I'm glad that I met some of the poets, and was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll have other conversations like this in future.
That would be a pleasure. Thank you.
Have a good festive season.
Yes, and you too. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Bye.